Welcome to CPAC Now, America Uncanceled. The Justice Department has become unglued from reality. AG Merrick Garland has decided to use the DOJ as an arm of the Democratic Party, essentially an apparatchik, and is actively harassing political opponents. Roughly 40 subpoenas have gone out in the past week to Trump allies, demanding personal communications. This on top of them demanding financial documentation of their lives. The DOJ is not going after crimes, but thinking wrong. One subpoena asked for information about whether the vice president had the authority to reject presidential electors. It's gone further than just subpoenas. The FBI has seized more than cell phones you could even imagine, but 3 most recently in the past week, including, we learned yesterday, Mike Lindell's cell phone. Apparently, a good night's sleep is no longer allowed in Biden's America. Jeff Clark, who's with us today, is the former DOJ Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Division and has been a target of the DOJ's harassment and House Democrats. He joins us today to break down this insanity. Jeff Clark, it is such an honor to have you with us. And, you know, as a fellow American, I'm so sad to see what our country is doing in weaponizing the Department of Justice.
I'm saddened as well, Matt. And Matt and Mercy, thanks for having me. And, I think that the thing I think that best encapsulates what's going on at this point is a title that Tucker Carlson chose months ago for a documentary he put up on Fox Nation, Patriot Purge. We're seeing an attempted purge of, the Republicans, in an ascendant party as we get closer and closer to the election. And there's a mass intimidation effort, and an effort especially directed at lawyers to try to intimidate them so that they can't represent their clients properly as they're under assault both from DOJ and from the January 6th committee.
Yeah, I have to say, Jeff, I don't think I've ever seen such an aggressive stance coming out of the Department of Justice and from the FBI, where their target and their focus is anyone that is a Trump supporter, and really just, I think, trying to find a crime. I mean, we always knew the FBI was where the leadership was truly political, but this has gone way too far. Where do you think this ends?
Well, I don't want to think about where it ends, because if we look back in history, we see what happens when these kinds of efforts begin, right? They're the kinds of things that lead to the destruction of republics, like the destruction of the Weimar Republic, or the destruction of democracies, nascent democracies in Central South America. I don't want to see that happen to my country. I'd like to think that with what we have that remains of the classical Constitution and what we have that remains of an independent judicial branch, that we're going to see enough pushback, and that the harder other branches of government currently in the hands of the Democrat Party push, the stronger the pushback and reaction is going to be. And I'm also obviously looking for a reaction at the ballot box, but it's not trending in a good direction. It seems to become more comprehensive and more diabolical and more energetic as each passing week occurs. And now, after the congressional recess is lifted, the January 6th committee is going to be back in session, and they say they're going to have another hearing at the end of the month and then release a report in October, again, conveniently right before the elections.
Jeff Clark, how long were you at the Department of Justice?
I was at the Department of Justice for 4 years in the Bush administration, and then I was there for more than 2 years in the Trump administration, and I had a Senate confirmed spot in the Trump administration, running 400 lawyers, and then I got an extra 1,000 lawyers added to my charge, the only assistant attorney general who ran 2 divisions.
I was out on the road, as Mercy knows, in Nevada, finding an extraordinary amount of voter fraud, shocking amounts of voter fraud, more than I ever thought I would see.
Matt, you're not supposed to talk about voter fraud.
Oh, I'm sorry.
They say, remember,
supposed to be a knock at the door.
The FBI might be knocking on the door because of this.
How does our former Attorney General Bill Barr square the most obvious and basic information that demonstrates, they're even bragging about spending $417 million to fortify the election, which is essentially to green light voter fraud. How does the former Attorney General Bill Barr square the fact that he doesn't see widespread voter fraud when he told us before the election if we voted by mail, there would be widespread voter fraud.
Yeah, Matt, I don't know, to use your pillow joke at the start, how you can say that, do that about face and sleep at night, because he did make a big about face, right? He was talking about how mail-in ballots were ripe for fraud right before the election, and then magically after the election, there's nothing to see here, move along. And obviously with each passing month, as we went in deeper into 2021 even, now that we're obviously getting to the close of 2022, we've seen so many issues. You referred to the Zuckerbucks issue. Why wasn't that investigated? It should have been. If you haven't focused on two developments, I'd like to point you to them, which are the best possible answer I can give you. One is the anecdote of the U.S. Attorney in Philadelphia, and I'm from Philadelphia originally, and I know that voter fraud takes place in Philadelphia. I remember famous cases in the 90s, the Nueva Forma scandal in particular, which was going around at a time when I was interviewing for a clerkship with a federal judge in Philadelphia. And that former U.S. attorney in the Trump administration, Bill McSwain, said that he found a significant voter fraud, voter irregularity case. He wanted to have a press conference about it. He wanted to investigate it. And he went forward to former Attorney General Barr. He asked for his blessing for that. He was told, no, don't do that. Don't have the press conference. Right. And if you have any information, turn it over to the Democrat AG of Pennsylvania. And that person had already pre-announced that Trump was going to lose the election. And the other anecdote, which is I don't think has been as widely covered, is sworn testimony from Heidi Stirrup, who at the time was the liaison from the Justice Department to the White House and vice versa. She had a meeting with Bill Barr and his then chief of staff, and she asked what's going on in terms of investigating the election. And basically, from her testimony, Barr said, well, we're not really investigating very much because A, it would take too long. Criminal investigations take forever. Parenthetical there, criminal tools are not the only ones that the Justice Department has. So however long a criminal investigation takes, I think that's a lame excuse. And second, that it's really more appropriate for the states to be doing that investigation. And I just think it's silly to imagine that the number two law enforcement officer in the country, because I think the president is always the number one law enforcement officer of the country, for such a person to say, oh, it's not a federal role, it's a state role, when you're talking about the highest office in the United States under the Constitution at issue, that is clearly a federal role. So I think both of those data points show that former AG
Jeff,
Barr was asleep at the switch.
Asleep at the switch is right, but let me just say, parenthetically, it's not like the federal government hasn't intervened on voting questions throughout our history. So the idea that somehow this is a topic that the feds can't touch is ridiculous, and history belies that.
I agree with that, Matt, and indeed, there's a public integrity section at DOJ. There's, there are voting rights parts of the Justice Department, and they have looked at elections before. Now, they had created a policy, one that I think is upside down, that they would only look at election issues after the election was over, when they could precisely do no good. AG Barr, to his credit, reversed that policy. But if you're reversing that policy on paper, but you're telling people like Heidi Stirrup and former U.S. Attorney in Philadelphia, Bill McSwain, you're not going to really investigate, then it looks like you're kind of going through an exercise of form, but not of substance.
With all these subpoenas that have happened recently, just this week, obviously Mike Lindell was one of them. There's a Washington Post story saying that FBI seizes Mike Lindell's phone in this probe of this Colorado voting machine breach. What I love about the story is that it says, it's Mike Lindell being MyPillow founder and prominent election denier. Okay, and so I've got to ask you this. Is there a correlation between what the FBI is doing and the fact that they are targeting what they call the so-called election deniers? Because let's remember that last time I checked, the Democrats denied plenty of presidential elections, but apparently we're not allowed to talk about it.
That's right, Mercy. They denied the 2000 election, and indeed they continue to. And the law professoriate constantly attacks the Bush v. Gore Supreme Court decision. They said the 2004 election was stolen by machine. They questioned the legitimacy of the 2016 election on the basis that there was foreign Russian interference. And some of the same people on the January 6th committee, like the chairman, Benny Thompson, and Jamie Raskin, were among those who questioned that result. So it is hypocritical. And I think the whole idea of an election denier, as you say, is part of the left's playbook. Right. One of the issues I've been involved with, for a lot of years, is the issue of climate change. And if you question that issue, you're called a climate denier. So, whatever issue essentially that the conservative liberty forces in America take positions on, the mainstream press labels them as deniers, as if it's crackpot, when in reality, they're the ones ignoring the evidence and the logic.
I think we should just all really jump onto these denial things, because it seems to be what's right. If they say it's denial, gender denial, whatever the next thing is.
Yeah, that's a great point. I do want to bring up a great tweet by Julie Kelly as well.
By the way, Julie Kelly, thank you for what you're doing.
Yes.
It's so great to read your Twitter feed and get what's behind the news.
Yeah, she says, I bet the prosecutors who work at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia could use some nice pillows. One wonders how they sleep at night. Buy a few on their behalf, and then she's promoting the MyPillow. I mean, seriously, we're going after the MyPillow guy. This is as far as it's going. So let me ask you this: we've seen what's happened with Mike Lindell. We've seen what's happened with how they're now pushing forward with more of these hearings on January 6th, and then we saw the raid at Mar-a-Lago just over a month ago. Interestingly enough, a poll came out just today. It was in the Miami Herald, saying that 45% of survey respondents said they would vote for Trump in 2024. 42% would choose Joe Biden, and then we've got 13% that's unsure. So it's showing that this raid's not necessarily impacting the president. Where do you think the public sentiment is on what we saw happen with the FBI raid, the unprecedented FBI raid of Donald Trump's home in Mar-a-Lago?
I think the polling results, Mercy, on the Mar-a-Lago raid and on how the public is receiving the January 6th committee hearings are like the flip side of one another, right? I think the public really doesn't care about the January 6th hearings, but I think that anger is growing at the unprecedented nature and aggressive nature of the Mar-a-Lago raid. There's no reason, when you're talking about a glorified dispute about the Presidential Records Act, a civil enactment that doesn't have criminal enforcement powers tied into it, being treated as if it's, public enemy number one, when they could have just continued a negotiation process if they wanted additional documents, as they had already received some documents already. They're trying to bolt criminal statutes that don't fit into the Presidential Records Act, claim it's like a unified whole when it's not. If Congress had wanted to put criminal enforcement powers into the Presidential Records Act, they would have written the statute differently, but they didn't do that.
Yeah, the other thing that's interesting is this whole question about the Senate's role in certifying an election and certifying the vote of the Electoral College. I think it's interesting, there's a new bill afoot to make the role of the Vice President of the Senate purely ceremonial. If they have to change the law to make it purely ceremonial, does that mean it's not purely ceremonial? And the second part of that question is that if a senator sees widespread corruption in a state, isn't it reasonable that they'd want to have those concerns remedied before they take a public vote on whether an electoral count is right or wrong?
Yes, Matt, precisely. I think all those points are well taken. And you started, this interview by referring essentially to the concept of thought crime in terms of what these recent, 40 subpoenas or so are doing, looking for information about, how the Electoral College works, how the certification works, how state legislatures play into that process. And it does suggest that if they want to try to reform the Electoral Count Act, that perhaps the theories that prior law professors had taken and that John Eastman had urged be followed, that these theories are not as crazy as the left pretends. So they're doing two contradictory things, right? They're pretending those theories had absolutely no value, while at the same time desperately trying to reform the statute to make sure that those theories could not be done again. And those two things are not consistent. And that, law professors and other lawyers and other people in the country should be able to petition their government for a redress of grievances. And that includes not just the courts, which tends to be how the left sees it these days. Trump's cases failed in the courts, that's it. No, there are other branches of government. You can petition the House and the Senate for a redress of grievances. Here, you could also petition the state legislatures for a redress of grievances, because that's how Article 2 worked in terms of how the president gets elected. And all of that's being ignored, and they're trying in that subpoena, which you referred to the terms of, Matt, at the start, they're trying to create a thought crime. It really is 1984-like.
Let me ask you this. Obviously, all the articles are out there saying that this will end up, basically the actions that have been taken against the president, that this will end up with the president being indicted. Do you think that's going to be the case?
I don't know what they're fully capable of as they, continue to turn the temperature up. I've seen some commentators, both supposedly conservative friends, and then folks on the left say, well, it's inevitable that President Trump will be indicted. I don't think that it's necessarily so inevitable, and I think that Attorney General Garland has been cautious and very deliberative in the past in some instances, or many instances. And I think that he needs to turn off the TV. He needs to turn off MSNBC or CNN or advisors who are telling him about those things, because there is a massive pressure campaign underway to try to force his hand. I watch it every day in YouTube videos by the like of Glenn Kirshner or Joyce Vance or other legal talking heads they have on MSNBC. They've decided that they're going to try to just turn up the temperature on him as a way of trying to turn up the temperature on Donald Trump. And I think it's fundamentally illegitimate, and he should resist it.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting that you say that, because what I hear in your answer is a plea for Merrick Garland to go back and grab the reputation he used to have before he chucked it over to the side of the road, which he was considered a moderate, he was considered careful, he was considered judicious, maybe liberal, but a real lawyer. And what he looks since that time is very political. And it would actually be good for the country if he would go back to the old reputation. I'll tell you something else that's crazy, Jeff, and I know we have to bring this conversation to a close, but a better politician in the White House would simply pardon the president and say, enough's enough, we've made our points. We think that the election was fair and square, but we, like you said, we can't put people in prison for thought crimes. And the idea of a former president running for president in legal jeopardy is just not consistent with the American ideal. But I'm worried we won't see that Joe Biden, and I'm worried we won't see that Merrick Garland.
Well, Matt, I think that is an interesting note to close on. I mean, we obviously saw President Ford think in that vein, even though he had a presidential election coming up, which I'm sure he would like to. And he lost
for that reason. Let's face it.
Exactly. And look, so I hope that saner and cooler heads prevail and more deliberative approaches prevail. But look, when you see things like the alarming red speech with President Biden bathed in dark red light before Independence Hall of all things, which I think is sacrilegious, with flanked by Marines, talking about insurrectionists and MAGA fascists and the like. You have to worry that they're just going to keep pressing the foot to the gas on this, and I hope they don't. I pray they don't. I don't think the country should want to see that happen, and I hope for the Republic's sake it doesn't happen.
Yeah, but I think to add to that, we just saw Tim Ryan also. He had to, basically take back his words by saying that he would, quote unquote, kill and confront the movement. That's what we need to do. It's about kill and confront the MAGA movement. It's huge, dangerous rhetoric. This is a propaganda that the left is pushing. It's not about necessarily going after the politicians or those of us who serve. It is about going after every single Trump supporter and saying you need to deny this president and not support, President Trump and the work that he did. And it's a sad state of affairs that we're seeing in our nation. But Jeff Clark, thank you so much for joining us. We need to do this again. You only make us smarter, so we're So glad to be with you, and please, big salute to a dear friend, Russ, who I know works with you and is also a great American patriot.
Thank you very much, Mercy and Matt, and would love to do it again, and have a great day.
And we'll be with you again tomorrow.